Donald woke before sunrise in his small Cape Cod house on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, as he had every day for the past 20 years. He eased out of bed and slipped on his worn slippers, the wooden floor cold beneath his feet. In the kitchen, he filled the kettle and set it to boil, then folded the morning paper in half and settled into the creaky chair by the window, watching the fog lift from the marsh across the road. The steam rose in gentle spirals as he sipped his coffee, his mind drifting to the day ahead. Jane, his wife, lay paralyzed in the bedroom since that terrible fall so many winters ago. He had left his teaching job to care for her, learning how to dress her, bathe her, feed her spoon by patient spoon, and read aloud when her eyes grew heavy. He was proud in a quiet way of the routine they'd built, a routine that bound him to every ache in his back, every pinch in his shoulders. When the kettle clicked off, he poured the hot water into her teacup, added a tea bag and carried the tray, oatmeal, soft fruit, tea, into the room where she lay propped on pillows. He placed the tray on the bedside table and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "Good morning, Jane," he said, but her eyes never opened, so he left without waiting for her to speak. In the hallway, he paused by the nurse's station to drop off the empty tray. A young aide glanced up and smiled at him in that familiar way that called him the devoted husband. He nodded and turned to leave, but then he froze. From inside Jane's room came her voice, weak but sharp. "He's nothing but a free servant." The words struck him like a hammer. He pressed his hand to his chest as if to still his racing heart, but the pounding only grew louder. He tipped his head toward the door, willing himself to hear more. But the aide's footsteps approached and the moment shattered. Donald stepped back into the corridor, careful not to meet the aide's eyes. In that brief, sharp instant, the world he had known collapsed. All those years of care, every spoonful of soup, every midnight turn, every form filed with trembling fingers, suddenly felt like a contract he had signed without reading the fine print. He clutched the rail along the wall, breathing shallowly, trying to push down the shock, but each heartbeat echoed Jane's words. Free servant. She had never thanked him in a way that felt real, always a gentle, "Thank you," always tempered with an expectant smile. But this was a confession. She saw him as nothing more than unpaid labor, a temporary convenience to be her arms and eyes in an unforgiving body. As he rounded the corner, the morning light seemed too bright, too revealing. He followed the echo of his own slow steps back to the waiting car outside, the morning county lights sharp on the hood. In that drive home, the road unfolded before him like the pages of a new book, each mile a question. Who am I if not her servant? What comes after silence? He parked under the big oak in his yard, its bare branches scratching the cold sky, and sat for a long minute in the driver's seat. Then he reached into his coat pocket and touched something small and folded. A blank sheet of paper he had tucked there earlier, just in case he ever needed to write something down. His hand did not tremble now. He started to unfold it. Donald spent the rest of that day in a strange daze. After he unfolded the blank sheet of paper in his coat pocket, he found only a faint pencil mark at the bottom corner, almost as if he had once intended to write something there, then changed his mind. He refolded it and put it back in his pocket, then went inside and set about his usual tasks without really seeing them. He heated water for tea, swept the front porch, straightened the living room cushions, and checked Jane's oxygen tanks. Each motion felt hollow, as if he were moving through someone else's life. As the afternoon light softened, he found himself wandering into the study, the small room lined with shelves of leather-bound books and file folders he had kept for years. He ran a hand along the spines, remembering the time he'd spent cataloging every volume when he first met Jane, her love of poetry, his taste for history, their shared collection of travel guides. Now he felt a distance between those memories and the man he had become. He sat at the desk and opened a drawer that held old photographs, wedding portraits, family reunions, vacations in Maine. He touched one of the pictures, a smiling Jane in a wide-brimmed hat, leaning on his shoulder beside a crashing wave, and a quiet anger rose in him. He closed the drawer and stood, pacing the room until his shoes tapped a steady rhythm on the hardwood floor. He paused by the window, looking out at the empty driveway and the bare oaks beyond. Then he crossed to the filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer where he had stored Jane's long-neglected personal papers. He found the folders, blue for her medical history, red for their joint finances, yellow for wills and insurance forms, and spent the next hour sorting through each one in silence. He placed relevant items on the desk. The initial will they had drawn up together when they bought this house, the insurance policy he had paid for every month without complaining, and the draft will he had once seen, unsigned, buried under a stack of hospital bills, naming her sister as sole heir. He stared at that draft until the edges blurred and his heart thumped in his ears. He could feel the weight of every check he had written. Every night he had slept on the futon in the den so he could hear if she called. He felt the sting of betrayal that burned in his chest, but also a curious spark of clarity. He had given more than he had ever taken, and for what? As dusk settled, he went to the kitchen and made himself a simple dinner, toast and cheese, and ate at the small table. Sheet music from his old piano hobby pressed flat under his plate. He left out nothing for Jane. She would not notice. He washed his plate, and instead of returning to the living room, he went back to the study with a fresh pad of paper and a pen. He wrote at the top, "Plan to reclaim everything." Below it, he drew 3 headings: legal steps, financial audit, and personal choices. Under legal steps, he listed 1. Consult probate attorney in Boston. 2. File petition to contest will. 3. Freeze joint accounts. Under financial audit, he wrote 1. Gather bank statements for last 20 years. 2. Review insurance policies. 3. Verify property deeds. Under personal choices, he put 1. Decide whether to continue caregiving. 2. Where to live if marriage ends. 3. Reconnect with daughter Anna. He paused, pen in hand, and stared at the page, then added a final line in smaller letters. 4. Reveal Emily's secret. Emily was Jane's sister, the one named in the draft will. Donald remembered the few times Emily had visited, her 2 bright dresses, the way she lingered at his side, whispering about family unity and the future of the estate. Always too eager, always too sly. He recalled her searching gaze when she thought no one watched, the way she examined his wedding band as if calculating its value. That memory gave him a cold thrill. He closed the notebook and pushed it away, heart pounding. He realized that his devotion had been turned into leverage against him, and now he would use it in return. The next morning, Donald woke before dawn again, but this time he dressed in his old cardigan and took breakfast to Jane without greeting her. He pressed the tray down and whispered, "I have work to do." Then he returned to the study and made a series of phone calls. First, he rang Margaret O'Connell, the probate lawyer in Boston. He told her he had the draft will and wanted to know how soon they could meet. She gave him an appointment in 2 days. He thanked her and hung up, then dialed the number for the local bank manager. Under the guise of routine questions, he asked for copies of all statements on his and Jane's joint accounts, from their opening date to the present. The manager agreed to email them that afternoon. Donald nodded quietly, his pulse steady but bright with new purpose. Finally, he called his daughter Anna, who lived in Gloucester. He spoke softly. "Anna, it's Dad. I'd like to come see you next week. Something important has come up." He did not mention Jane or the hospital. He simply said he needed her help. Anna's voice trembled with concern, but she agreed immediately. Donald leaned back in his chair, listening to her promise to make time. When he hung up, the study felt warmer, more alive. He closed the blinds on Jane's study window, shutting out the muted light. In the darkness, he gathered the draft will and the notebook with his plan, tucked them into his briefcase, and walked quietly out the door. The hall light blinked off behind him, and he paused for a moment, smelling the hush of midnight around the house. Then he stepped onto the porch, pulled the door shut, and set off down the driveway, the thin beam of his flashlight guiding him toward a future he would shape himself. Donald rose before dawn the next morning, his mind still humming with purpose. He dressed in a dark blazer and pressed shirt, the clothes he'd worn to Jane's hospital visits, because today he would face new kinds of meetings. He poured coffee for himself and left Jane's breakfast tray untouched. She would not notice immediately. In the early light, he drove the winding roads north to Boston, where Margaret O'Connell welcomed him into her wood-paneled office. He laid out the draft will on her polished desk and explained how he had overheard Jane's cruel words. Margaret nodded thoughtfully and said she had seen many such cases. A spouse pushed aside by long illness and family maneuvering. She assured him that under Massachusetts law, he could petition the probate court to void the draft will and claim a fair share of the marital estate. She outlined the steps: file a formal petition in Salem probate court, serve notice to all interested parties, freeze joint accounts and insurance payouts, and request full financial disclosure from Jane's sister Emily. As Donald listened, he felt a fierce surge of relief and calculated resolve. He signed the retainer agreement, and Margaret promised to file the petition by the end of the week. After leaving the lawyer's office, Donald stopped at a cafe on Boylston Street and ordered a simple sandwich. He reviewed the list he had made: gather every bank statement, locate insurance policies, confirm the house deed, and find proof of Emily's undue influence. He noticed a small note in his notebook: check Emily's last visit details. A chill brushed his spine as he recalled Emily's too eager manner the last time she had dropped by the house. She had commented on his neat filing system, on the comfort of their home, and she had lingered by Jane's wheelchair as if calculating how best to move in. He resolved to dig into her movements that week. Returning home, the sun was high in the sky, and the oaks around his lawn cast skeletal shadows on the frost-dimmed grass. He paused at the front door, steadying himself. The house looked the same, but he was no longer the same man who walked those rooms in silent devotion. He carried his briefcase, a symbol now of his new life, inside and set it on the hallway table. He walked quietly to the study, where envelopes from the bank plopped onto the floor as if eager to spill their secrets. He knelt beside the envelopes and tore them open one by one, pulling out stacks of statements that charted 20 years of deposits and withdrawals. He sorted them by year, stacking each pile in neat rows across his desk. As he worked, he noticed patterns: payments to Jane's therapist, car insurance premiums, property taxes, his own modest pension deposits. But he also saw transfers of large sums to Emily's account: tuition payments for her daughter, a new Mercedes, a down payment on a condo in Salem. The transfers were regular and significant, far beyond what one sister might justly receive. He traced the entries back to the year Jane's accident, when Emily first started receiving monthly checks. His chest tightened as he realized how deeply Emily had embedded herself in their finances. Donald gathered the statements into a single envelope marked bank evidence and turned to the filing cabinet. He pulled open the yellow folder labeled Insurance and Wills and found copies of Jane's life insurance policy. He compared the beneficiary list with the draft will and saw that Emily was listed as the primary beneficiary. He wrote down the policy number and amount of coverage, large enough to buy a comfortable home. He tucked copies into another envelope labeled Insurance Evidence. Then, under a stack of old tax returns, he found a letter from their mortgage lender showing that the house had appreciated significantly during their marriage. He noted the increase in value and added the document to the property evidence folder. As he worked, he felt a careful calm settle over him. Each page he placed in a folder was another piece of the story he would tell the court: that he had devoted 20 years of his life and labor to this marriage, and that the estate's value had grown under his silent stewardship. Late that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Donald opened it to find Emily standing on the porch, her face painted with concern. She held a small leather case. "I thought you might want this," she said, handing him the case. Inside was the gold locket Jane had worn on their wedding day, engraved with their initials. Donald felt a flash of regret for the warm times they once shared, but he said nothing. "Thank you," he replied quietly, closing the case. Emily hesitated, then stepped inside. She glanced around the hallway, curiously noting the briefcase on the table. "Big day," she asked, her voice soft. Donald invited her to the living room, and she sank onto the sofa where Jane usually sat. He offered her tea and sat opposite, watching her carefully. Emily spoke of family, of concern for Jane, but her eyes flickered to the study door, as if searching for something. Donald realized she must suspect his actions, and perhaps she knew something of his visit to Margaret. He let her talk for a few minutes, then asked her gently, "How long have you been helping with the mortgage payments?" Emily's smile froze. "Oh, that was just to help out when Jane was ill," she said quickly. "Family helps family." Donald nodded slowly and said, "I've been reviewing our finances." It seems those payments began right after Jane's accident in '05. Emily's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She opened her mouth, then closed it, staring at the teacup in her hands. A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Donald watched her, his voice calm when he spoke again. "I'm including those transfers in my petition. The court will want to know why you received more than $500,000 over the years." Emily's face paled and she rose abruptly, mumbling an excuse about visiting Jane. Donald walked her to the door and held it open. As she fled down the porch steps, he looked after her, realizing his hidden bombshell had been planted. That evening, Donald sat at the dining table under the soft glow of a single lamp. He placed the evidence folders in a neat row before him. Bank evidence, insurance evidence, property evidence, and a final slender folder he labeled Emily's transfers. He reviewed each document once more, making sure every date and amount was clear. Then in the notebook under legal steps, he checked off consulted lawyer, gathered statements, and documented transfers. Under personal choices, he scribbled, "Decide on living arrangements," and "Contact Anna." He took a long breath and closed the notebook. Outside, the night was still, the house silent save for the hum of the refrigerator. He felt the weight of what he had set in motion, the probate petition waiting in Margaret's hands, the bank accounts frozen, the evidence ready for court, and Emily's fear at his revelation. He understood that Jane might never recover what she had lost, but he no longer cared. He was no longer her servant. He was a man who had chosen himself, and he would see this through with steady determination. Before turning in, Donald walked down the hallway to Jane's door. He placed a single candle on her bedside table and lit it, the flame flickering in the dim room. He stood for a moment, looking at her still form, and whispered, "The truth will come out." Then he closed the door gently, returned to his study, and flicked off the lamp. In the darkness, he felt the first true peace he had known in years, certain that tomorrow would bring the next move in his plan, and that each step would bring him nearer to freedom. Donald woke before dawn again, but this time his mind was steady rather than racing, filled with the steps he would take in court. He dressed carefully in a charcoal suit and dark tie, the clothes he had kept for special occasions. Over breakfast, he reviewed the folder marked petition documents one last time. The draft will, the bank and insurance evidence, the property valuation, and the notes on Emily's transfers. Each sheet had a colored tab, a quiet signal of his precision. He set the files in his briefcase, kissed Jane's forehead as she lay sleeping beside him, and whispered, "Today it changes." He drove through the cold November air to the Salem probate court, where the red brick building rose against a gray sky. Inside, the marble floors echoed his footsteps as he followed Margaret O'Connell and her paralegal into the judge's chamber. Jane's sister Emily stood to one side, looking pale and small in a sleek black coat, while Jane remained unseen, absent by court order. The judge, an older man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed the petition. Undue influence, lack of consideration for 20 years of caregiving, and improper beneficiary designations. Margaret spoke clearly, laying out how the evidence showed Emily had engineered large financial transfers, accepted gifts far beyond what family would normally request, and colluded with Jane to draft a will that cut Donald out entirely. She handed the judge a bound copy of the bank statements, pointing to the red ink totals of hundreds of thousands in transfers to Emily's account. The judge studied the pages, frowned, and nodded. He then asked Emily to speak. Her voice trembled as she denied any wrongdoing, claiming the transfers were tokens of love for her suffering sister, that she had only helped with expenses. But when asked about the timing, immediately after Jane's accident, her explanations faltered. Margaret produced Jane's own hospital records linking Emily's first large deposit to the day after the accident. The courtroom grew still, as if everyone sensed the hidden truth revealing itself. Emily's eyes flicked to Donald, her lips quivering, and Donald felt a steady clarity. He was no longer trapped by pity or doubt. Over the next hour, evidence was laid out with careful precision. The life insurance policy naming Emily as primary beneficiary, the appraisal showing the house's moonshot in value, thanks in part to Donald's unpaid renovations, and the audio transcript of Jane's hospital confession, her words "free servant," recorded on a worn device Donald had placed in his pocket that morning. When the judge asked about the tape, Margaret explained how it was lawfully recorded by a party to the conversation. The judge leaned forward, and Emily's composure finally cracked. She turned away, wiping tears. As Margaret made her closing statement, she said, "This is not revenge. It is justice for a man who sacrificed everything for the benefit of another's gain." Donald felt a surge of quiet satisfaction as the judge pounded the gavel, granting his petition to void the draft will, ordering the bank to release funds frozen in the joint accounts, and directing the insurance company to name Donald as primary beneficiary. Emily collapsed into her chair, head in her hands, and as the courtroom emptied, Donald paused by her side, quietly saying, "I never wanted this to be public, but you left me no choice." Emily looked up, her face pale with shame, and could only nod. Outside, the November drizzle had begun, softening the world. Donald held the folder of original documents tightly, imagining each one as a broken chain link in his former life of servitude. He drove home slowly, each turn of the wheel unburdening him, heading toward a future where he would no longer kneel for anyone. At home, he found Jane awake in her wheelchair by the window, looking out at the rain. He wheeled her to the kitchen table, placed a tray of warm soup before her, and said gently, "We're secure now." Jane turned, eyes soft with surprise, but she said nothing. Donald realized that her gratitude would come in time. For now, he simply gave her the comfort she needed, while he himself felt a lightness he had not known in years. Late that evening, the doorbell rang. Anna had arrived from Gloucester. She rushed in, wrapping her arms around her father in a fierce hug that left Donald breathless. Over tea in the study, he told her what had happened. The petition granted, the funds secured, and Emily forced to pay back a portion of her ill-gotten gains. Anna's eyes filled with tears of relief as she placed a hand on his, and Donald felt a warmth that came not from duty, but from love freely given. Before bed, he placed the judge's order in the yellow folder with all his evidence, then locked it in the cabinet alongside his personal notebook, now etched with the timeline of his redemption. As he climbed into bed, he looked at Jane's peaceful face and realized the greatest revenge bombshell would come later, when Emily had to live with her choices and public disgrace. In that quiet hour before sleep, Donald understood fully that caring for someone must be an act of love, not a trap, and that by reclaiming his life, he had delivered the true reckoning this family needed. Donald woke that morning to a gentle hush in the house, the kind of quiet that follows a storm, and for the first time in decades, he did not feel the weight of obligation pressing on his chest. He dressed in a soft sweater and took his time brewing tea in the kitchen, slipping a biscuit into the microwave for Jane before wheeling her to the sunroom to watch the early light dance on the maple leaves. As he settled into the rattan chair opposite her, he realized how strange it felt not to be dreading calls from banks or shuffling through legal papers. Those tasks were finished, sealed away in Margaret's office in Boston, and today was the first morning he could simply be a husband rather than a servant or litigant. After tea and biscuits, he wheeled Jane back to her favorite spot by the window, kissed her forehead and whispered, "Today we begin again," then left the house with his briefcase, empty now of petitions and evidence, and drove north to his daughter Anna's cottage in Gloucester, memories of their last hug still warming his heart. The coastal roads wound past salt marshes and clam shacks, and Donald felt a lightness in his chest he had not known since before Jane's accident. At the cottage, Anna greeted him with a bright smile and her own pot of fresh coffee. They talked about small things first, how the garden was blooming with late-blooming chrysanthemums, how her work at the art museum was going, how the neighbor's dog still chased seagulls on the lawn. Then Anna produced a file folder of her own, labeled Housing Options, with printouts of senior living communities and small condo listings. Donald sorted through them, surprised by how little he cared about now having the money to choose any option. He realized what he wanted was freedom and presence, not luxury. They agreed he would stay with Anna for a few weeks to rest and rebuild, and he felt a quiet thrill at the thought of carving out this new life on his own terms. After lunch, they walked to the shore, the Atlantic breezes crisp and bracing, and Donald let the salt air fill his lungs as Anna held his arm, guiding him over the rocks to the water's edge. He watched as she tossed a pebble into the surf, sending ripples across the gray-blue sea, and he thought of how those ripples mirrored his own small wave of change, quiet at first, but unstoppable. Later, over dinner of steamed clams and buttered rolls, he shared with Anna the plans he had drafted before leaving Salem. A modest part-time job editing travel guides, a blog he would start for caregivers who felt trapped, and a list of books he longed to read. Anna squeezed his hand and said, "You deserve this, Dad." And for the first time, he smiled fully, without restraint. That night, he lay in the guest room bed, listening to Anna's soft breathing next door, and felt grateful for the hard journey that had led him here. Over the next days, Donald settled into a gentle routine. Mornings spent journaling in the sunroom of the cottage, afternoons walking along the beach or helping Anna in her garden, evenings reading by the fire. He began drafting his first blog post titled, "Finding Myself After Caregiving," using simple, honest language to share his story. And when Anna reviewed the draft, she cried and hugged him, promising to help him publish it. One afternoon, as they returned from a stroll, Donald's phone buzzed. It was Margaret's office confirming the insurance company had processed the beneficiary change, and the funds were released into his account. He thanked her and closed the phone, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness, just a quiet completion. That evening, he found an email from Nancy, the friend who had sheltered him in her flower shop. She sent a picture of freshly bloomed lilacs that bloom on purpose, and a note, "You are forever welcome here, my friend." Donald typed a quick reply of thanks and closed his computer. In bed that night, he thought of Nancy's words about dignity and of Emily's downfall, the public whispers and shame that had followed her after the court ruling. And he felt neither satisfaction nor malice, only the gentle recognition that justice had been served and he had reclaimed his personhood. As autumn's days shortened, Donald decided it was time to revisit Salem to collect his things and close that chapter. He told Anna, and she offered to drive him. On the day of the trip, they packed a small suitcase together, mementos of a life lived, photos of happier times, and a new journal he intended to fill with stories of hope. When they arrived at the old house, Donald paused at the threshold, feeling the echo of 2 decades of sacrifice in the silent rooms. He moved through each space calmly, the living room where he had read bedtime stories to grandchildren long since grown, the study where he had plotted his legal battle, the sunroom where he and Jane had watched the world slip into twilight, and in each room he left a simple note, "This room is mine no longer." In the bedroom, he picked up Jane's locket from the bedside table and slipped it into a small box. He chose to send it to Nancy, knowing she would care for it and remember both love and loss. By noon, the house was empty, and Donald locked the door, handed the keys to Anna, and said, "It's time." As they drove away, he watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror, its windows like eyes closing on his past. The road ahead glittered with sunlight, and Donald felt his heart light as he realized that he no longer belonged to anyone else's story. He belonged only to himself. For the first time in years, he looked forward to tomorrow.